join, but I think without losing much time, we could start. Good evening. I'm welcome to this evening's IWM lecture. I'm Ayşe Çağlar, a permanent fellow and a professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Vienna. We are very pleased and honored to have Martin Burckhardt, who is right now a fellow at IWM, for our IWM monthly lecture this evening. Martin Burckhardt is a true multidisciplinary scholar, artist, a multi-talent. He is a cultural theorist, essayist, author, audio artist, and programmer. Burckhardt studied German studies, theater studies, and history in Cologne. In his academic and artistic work, he engages with questions of digitalization, programming, game design, but also artificial intelligence and the cultural historical significance of the computer. He wrote several books in the field of philosophy of technology on digitalization, as well as the genealogy of the machine, including Digitale Metaphysik, 1988, The Universale Maschine, 1990, and a novel titled Score, Wir schaffen das Paradies auf Erden, 2015. He taught at different universities and academies, including Humboldt University, where he taught cultural studies, and Freie Universität Berlin, where he taught theater studies. From 1998 to 2000, he oversaw Interface Fellow for the Kulturbehörde Hamburg, a symposium, as well as an exhibition on computer culture. In 2014, he published Digitale Renaissance, in which he focused on the effects digitalization has on our societies. 2018, he published Philosophie der Maschine, in which he continued his philosophical explorations of the genealogy of the machine. We are also very lucky to have Timothy Snyder as the commentator of Martin Burckhardt's talk. Timothy Snyder is the Richard Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at IWM. He's an expert on Eastern Europe and the Second World War. He is the author of several books. I'm not going to list all of them. I will just pick and mention some of the titles of his books. Well known, The Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, 2010, and Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning, 2015, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, 2017, and The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America, 2018. In his recent work on digitalization, Timothy Snyder focused on how algorithms and artificial intelligence, strengthened by our own confirmation biases and vacuum created by weak conventional media, enable political actors to strategically shape the opinions and perceptions of huge target groups through the internet and social media. Here, his focus was on how strongly Russia influenced the outcome of the 2016 US presidential elections through social media. We are very much looking forward to this evening's IWM monthly lecture. The lecture is titled Alien Logic. The floor is yours, Martin Burckhardt. Welcome,
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. And here my special heartfelt thanks go to Timothy Snyder I'm honored and only hope that my talk today can live up to expectations. However, when I consider its title, Alien Logic, I think the best I can possibly do is to thoroughly disillusion you. When William Burroughs once said, "Language is a virus from outer space," I would emphasize that what interests me most is what is alien in myself. In this respect, my perspective is an anthropological one. I ask myself, I see. This wonderful picture of Malinowski. I ask myself, what would the present look like if one looked with the eyes of an anthropologist, for instance, as Malinowski looked at his propagandists a good 100 years ago? As an outsider, he realized he could analyze the tribe's socioeconomic system, but this clear-sightedness remained closed to the people within. And that's my first disillusionment. When I speak of alien logic, I do not mean something completely unheard of, but an insight well-known system blindness. And what's obviously missing here is the anthropologist, let's say. I would like to go further at this point and claim that the cause of our system blindness is not the hypercomplexity of our social systems, but the fact that we're not clear about our social engine. In fact, I'm deeply convinced that what we call digitization represents a collective psychic unconscious, a psychotope in parallel to the biotope. To prove the point, I could present you with the immortality fantasies of the transhumanist or dissect the astonishing excesses of German data protection. In doing so, however, I would lose the clarity of my thought, which states the machine is the unconscious. How does one come up with such an idea? The thought has a long history, and in my case, has been reflected in a series of cultural excursions and books. The stumbling block that got me into thinking, however, was an exceedingly simple question a child questions, in fact. It is, what actually is a computer? Well, if you understand the computer as a tool, as a medium that is supposed to cover a certain purpose, you quickly discover this question leads into the shoulders. A computer can be a typewriter, but can be used as well for text return or to track the geoposition data of a whale or a Mars rover. Since such a list can be endless, we speak of a universal machine that can be used for anything imaginable. So we're not so much dealing with a tool as with a prolific toolbox that creates tools in its own image. Using a Latin terminology, the tool can be understood as forma, formata, and the toolbox as a forma, formans, a form generating form, morphogenetic. The problem of the universal machine was the starting point that led me to drop the silverware that intellectual history has generously provided me. For if the concept of a tool becomes superfluous, you can't do media theory anymore. Not any more than you can philosophize with a hammer. So what to do? Of course, the first question is, has there been anything like this before? The answer is yes. Like the computer, the rework automaton of the Middle Ages is a universal machine. You can use it as a power plant, as water, wind, and tide mill, but equally well, this automaton can be used to control a group of figures on a cathedral, thus giving the example of a notation instrument from which polyphony music springs. And last but not least, you can use it as a mechanical clock and synchronize social life. Following this line of thought, the innovations of the 12th and 13th century are self-evident. Division of labor, money economy, interest. Or if we want to take a look at the corresponding psychological values, punctuality, tact, and precision. This story, however, becomes a real torment if we try to reconcile it with the philosophical historiography which lets the mechanical age begin in the 17th century. This brings us to the embarrassment of thinking of the 12th century automaton as a thing without a thinker, or conversely, to conclude that Descartes is late by several centuries at once. In any case, we have a gap where the real work automaton reshaped medieval society and did so without leaving significant traces in discourse. Total amnesia. Sure, there are symptoms, but when you deal with it, you're in the situation of a psychoanalyst who wants to bring repressed memories back into light. And that was my project. The exploration of the collective unconscious. Although this walk into cultural history has occasionally felt like entering a terra incognita, the leitmotif of this universal machine seemed an extremely reliable compass. The greatest stimulus, however, was that the material itself resonated, and the follow-up questions started rolling by themselves. To give an example, in my study of the Middle Ages, it became clear that the Gothic cathedral, is the place where proto-capitalism articulates in the clearest form. This is not only reflected in the Gothic skyscrapers, but also in technical innovations, such as the modularization of building components. At the same time, the social organization changed too: division of labor, money economy, emergence of guilds, and so forth. It's not by chance that Lynn White spoke of an industrial revolution of the Middle Ages. Not only are the marvels of this revolution, the cathedrals all dedicated to Notre Dame, but also the intellectuals sing the glory of Our Lady as the epitome of pure reason. So what could be more obvious than to focus on the veneration of Mary herself? And so you sit down and study the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, always with an eye to what that might have to do with the machine. You won't be surprised that one doesn't meet many like-minded people this way. In fact, this question alone was a double blasphemy for the historians of the dogma, but also for the technology freaks. But I nevertheless tried what was owed alone to my sense of intuition and to the meaning of the word mechanic, which I won't reveal to you yet. Spoiler alert. The surprise first. If there is a perfect machine, it's the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, a telepathic flying machine with which pure reason shoots itself up into the sky. There's a wonderful German word for that, ein Himmelfahrtskommando. So this brings us back to the initial thesis, according to which the machine functions as an unconscious. What is a machine anyway? Is it right that we associate a thing like objects here? I would say no. Because our computer world teaches us large parts of our machinery can become disembodied. Algorithm can turn human perceptions in the form of countless cat photos into a machine that identifies cats reliably. In this sense, one should dismiss the device-like machine as a historical obsession that blinds us to the fact that the machine is first and foremost a mental concept. A walk through history confirms this suspicion. The Greeks spoke of the mechanic long before this was linked to a material object. The oldest material object we can associate with the machine is the crane, which appeared in Greek tragedy in 5th century BC, the Deus ex machina. Now with this theologumenon, we're pretty well attuned to what the regress into prehistory may offer to us. So let's take a look at the word itself. It derives from the Indo-European root mag, which in the broadest sense covers the meaning of might and magic. In this sense, mechanic can be translated as cunning and deception of nature, which explains my passion for Blessed Mary's maiden flight. In short, the machine is that which is not nature, a negative potency. Certainly, from here we could, in Hegelian manner, indulge in speculative thinking. However, I would like to present the twin machines with which the regimen of the universal machine begins and culture leaves the realm of magic behind. There's first the alphabet and the lost form cast. However you name it, lost form cast, lost wax process, or cire perdu, this technique refers to the metallurgical practice which allowed the Cretans around 1500 BC to cast sculptures of their Zeus metallon, the metallic god. The link between metallurgy and alphabet is admittedly not self-explanatory. In shortest form, this connection can be illustrated by the myth of Cadmus, who brought the alphabet and the first Greek polis into being. At the beginning of the story, Cadmus gets the order from his father Agenor to bring Europa, who was kidnapped by Zeus, to Crete, back home to Phoenicia, which is the place of origin of the alphabetic characters, the phoenikoi, as Plato calls them. He sets off with a cow westward to the land of the cattle, Boeotia. Where the cow thrusts its horns into the ground, he is to settle. When this happens, and you can take this as a sign revolution, the moment when the Phoenician bull sign, the Aleph, turns into Greek Alpha, a dragon comes out of the cave. A battle begins. Cadmus kills the dragon and sows its teeth into the earth. The fertile ground sprouts little iron men, warriors who kill each other until only 5 remain, the vowels of the alphabet. We have here, as in every myth, a mental overdetermination. First, the alphabet. Then, metallurgy, the shape of the iron man which spring from the earth. Last but not least, the general reproduction order, the double shape of the dragon and the phallic bull. Obviously, the myth does not lack clarity. As an origin myth, it gives a clear indication that the machine has a fundamental role in the foundation of the polis. Not only the human world is affected by it, along with the betrayal of nature, a revolution in the pantheon takes place. Zeus rises to father God, and at the same time, among his descendants, there is this strange phenomenon of the double birth. Take Athena. She's an offspring of Zeus and Metis, but as we know, Zeus devours his wife. Thereupon, as a male, hysteric, he begins to suffer from a terrible headache, whereupon Hephaestus must extract the brain child from his skull. And Athena springs forth in full armor, her father's daughter. In short, logos spermaticus, abstract procreation, has taken the place of the natural procreation, by which we have located, quite incidentally, the starting point of male domination, the patriarchs of the patriarchy, the machine. What does it mean that an artificial intelligence substitutes itself for the natural order of things? Exactly what I have alluded to with the title Alien Logic. Because here thought figures come into play for which we have no model in nature. Let's just take the letter alpha, which has stripped off its bullshit. Having become an abstract phonetic sign, one can indulge in the illusion that this sign has always existed, thus representing something like an eternal truth. Plato demonstrates this magic trick in his Cratylus, where he devotes himself to the question of a divine original language. Although he concludes that this is no longer traceable due to the Babylonian confusion of languages, humans, however, still have the letters of the alphabet. And since these represent something like a divine DNA, the divine language can be restored. This is, of course, nothing but metaphysics, the conception of an uncreated, unchangeable, Parmenidean being endowed with procreative power. Historically, the morphogenetic potency of the alphabet is indeed enormous. Concepts like isomorphism, democracy, identity, causality, logic, etc. only make sense under the pretense of an alphabetic science system that has sunk into the unconscious. Similarly, The institution of law presupposes the unquestionable authority of scripture. What the classical philologists in great mental embarrassment called the Greek miracle is the eruption of that which is not nature, the machine, alien logic. Remarkable, however, is the fact that this social engine, although a product of reason, could sink back into the unconscious. Before we turn to the question of the lost form, I want to try to get to the bottom of the riddle. Imagine that you're a scholars of the 14th century. Because the world of the educated is small, you will have heard that one famous scholar has retrained God to be a watchmaker, while another has urged the princes of the world to regard their own bodies as clockwork. And of course, in the shadow of the cathedral, you'll be confronted with the sign of the times, which is time is money. In short, you will encounter this machine with a mixture of fascination and repulsion. Why fascination? Because a new system of order is visible here. Repulsion, because money, as a proliferating sign, announces a diabolical order that breaks with everything you ever believed in. Possibly you have also heard of the horrific story told by Cæsarius of Heisterbach. A female usurer is buried. And while the monk says the prayer to save her from purgatory, the corpse lies there quietly. But as soon as he is finished, the corpse lapses into this gesture of counting money. It can only be brought back to dead rest by the priest starting to pray again, counting money and praying. If the episode of the twitching corpse shows us the disruption of the medieval automaton, it's doubtful whether our monk will assign the different manifestations to one and the same cause, since the machine reveals itself in highly different forms, as a moral claim, as an economic ratio, finally, as a symbolic form in which reason transfigures itself. It's more likely that our monk will perceive them as different things that have nothing in common. Thus, the clock and the magically moving figures may convince him of God's grandiosity, while he wants to let the usual and the most beautiful cognitive dissonance burn in hellfire. But however he twists and turns, our monk will not be able to escape the underlying forma formans. For just as interest causes money to proliferate, the machine begins to proliferate in an uncanny way, producing countless offspring. In trying to save his Christian worldview, our monk will have to make a series of compromises which bring with them complicated follow-up problems. Take the sale of indulgences. It's the church reaction to proto-capitalism. Once the church understood that it was pointless to preach against interest, one proceeded without further ado to the modification of heaven. With the purgatory, one had established an intermediate floor between heaven and hell in which the usurers could work off their sins. Thus, the church had come to terms with the circumstances and started to sell the forgiveness of sins at the tear-off block. In the long run, however, this measure was a cause for the Protestants to tear down such a Babel of sin. When I speak of an outsourced unconscious, we can recognize in these mental derivatives a fundamental ratio. The sum of all these derivatives form the psychotope. Now the scholastic discourse, like our monk, may do its utmost to ignore it, but such a denial of reality doesn't last long. For with every business transaction, with the ticking of the clock alone, the psychotope gains in importance. To the extent that the preaching and action diverge, the psychotope must take the form of a social unconscious. If we contrast this unconscious with the Freudian one, the difference is striking. The difference is striking. For in the Freudian unconscious, there's neither time nor negation, and hence no ticking clock. Thus, Freud insists that it's the primordial halt which is at work here. In the psychotope, on the other hand, we are dealing with a historical and mutable apparatus. In order to understand it, one does not have to go back to the primal horde, the patricide, and the Oedipus complex. On the contrary, one has to realize how an alien logic affects the collective psyche. Accordingly, our psychotope also brings us into opposition with the theory of outsourcing that anthropology has put into the world. According to this theory, every human tool is the externalization of an inherent human capacity. The hammer is to be understood as a strengthened fist, the book as a reified memory, the computer finally as an outsourced brain. And thus it's clear, everything is predetermined in nature. There's nothing new under the sun. The alphabetic sign, however, is no more prefigured in nature than is the money sign, which generates surplus value out of the blue. Or the logic of the computer is laid down in George Boole's laws of thought. And since I've mentioned it, I will take the opportunity to show you the alienness of our digital world formula. Boole simply asks himself, what do 0 and 1 have in common? You multiply 0 by itself, and that always gives 0. And the same is true for 1. If we formalize this, we get the formula of our digital adversary nature, x equals x to the n. Translated into everyday language, one could say, I'm a population of myself, a multiplicity, a proliferation of threads. This may not be true for me as a natural person, but every digitized object may proliferate at the speed of light to an infinity that defies all laws of nature. If we want to understand what society is like in the digital psychotope, we have to change our perspective. Instead of starting from nature, we have to begin with a machine. And this in turn means alien logic. To paraphrase John F. Kennedy's famous quote, ask not what the machine can do for you, ask what does it mean, what does it want from you. To give you a little sample, I'm a good friend of a plastic surgeon, and he tells me about the strange operations he has to do. What do you think about a woman undergoing a beauty operation just to resemble a profile pic? That's a problem. If one ignores the universal machine, one runs the risk of self-deception. We don't even have to refer to the mistakes of anthropology, sociology, or media theory. We could just as well walk into the arcanum of AI. Here too, we are confronted with promises that seem to be religious, even chiliastic in origin. If we keep in mind that the forma formans implies a transcendency, this cannot be surprising. More peculiar, however, is the fact that the history of the computer, in a time obsessed with history, leads into a dark zone. Walking down the heroic figures of our computer culture, you will be confronted with puzzles that are, in terms of craziness, on a par with the great cases of psychoanalysis. Take Ada Lovelace, the self-professed high priestess of the machine who asks Babbage to rig her brain so that she can generate programs according to the model of the Immaculate Conception. Or Alan Turing, who commits suicide Snow White style, eating a poisoned apple. These are not individual extravagances, but precursors of an order that takes possession of society itself. Any approach based on individual psychology is misleading here. It would be much more accurate to think of the universal machine as a collective destiny. To the extent that the prehistory disappears into a black box, the fantasies that emerge from this magic machine increase in intensity. In the beginning, the deciphering of the novel's social engine is comparatively simple. However, the more tools are added, the more complicated deconstruction begins. One can no longer see the forest for the trees. The system of blindness simply stems from the fact that the abundance of tools buries the former formants under itself. Like with the medieval palimpsest or Wunderblock, whole layers of cover memories can be laid over it. The repressed then is not the one-time traumatic event which dates back to childhood, but rather a strange overfamiliarity, a pattern as ubiquitous as the air that I breathe. Basically, this has already been achieved with the alphabetical letter in an almost uncanny way. I was 35 years old when I stood at the parking lot of the State Library and opened the book that bore the beautiful title, Sign and Design, and promised elucidation on the psychogenetic sources of the alphabet. And then I saw for the first time what actually a child could have seen, but what Wittgenstein, linguistics, functionalism, structuralism had failed to teach me, that the sign Aleph had once been an image, a phallic bull. And that was the moment when the State Library rose up behind me and just flew away. Let's come back to the time track with which our A in logic begins. So let's put ourselves in a pre-alphabetic society, more precisely in the mind of a sculptor who imagines a sculpture of Zeus. A few centuries earlier, this man would have to struggle with a tree, stone, or rock of granite. Now he can content himself with shaping a waxy sculpture with his bare hands. Once it's done, this sculpture is covered with a layer of plaster. Then a few plaster pipes are added from which the wax can drain. The plastered object is now held over a fire with the effect that the plaster hardens, but the wax drains away. What we're left with is the negative of the sculpture, the lost form, cire perdu. Let's move on to the next step. Here at the latest, it should become clear that we're not dealing with the work of an original genius, but with a highly labor-intensive collective affair. For now, it's a matter of melting the ore that has been robbed from Mother Earth, as the people thought these days. You need a container capable of holding the molten ore, then to handle temperatures well above 1,000 degrees Celsius. Because our metallurgical society has mastered these sophisticated techniques, it can feed the molten metal into the plastic tubes that protrude from the mold. Typically, this is done by burying the mold in the ground and excavating it when the metal is cooled. Before I question this process for its mental implications, I want to quickly recount the birth myth which was told of this Cretan Zeus Metallon. There the goddess Rhea gives birth to the child Zeus on Mount Ida. In order to protect the child from the grasp of the devouring Kronos father, small iron men of the kind that we've seen in the Cadmus myth come to assist them. They beat wildly of the shields and this way drown out the cries of mother and child. Little Zeus now grows up in a cave. There he is nourished with nectar and ambrosia by sacred bees. That's a mistake. One day, some armed warriors arrange to find out what's going on in this cave, where once a year a great fire breaks out. They paint their faces with plaster, arm themselves with armor and shields, and set off. When they reach the cave, they are swarmed by the bees, which have apparently turned into killer bees. Nevertheless, they manage to catch a brief glimpse of the cave before they ascend to the sky, transformed into bees. And what do they see? A god in diapers. God in diapers. This is the secret that the cave of birth reveals to the gaze. With the last wax process in mind, it doesn't take much imagination to realize that the myth of Zeus' birth is to be understood as the apotheosis of human artistry, as mechane, machine, deception of nature. Let's make clear the structure of this process. In molten form, nature is annihilated, transformed into a plastic that offers no resistance. This metallurgical technique has survived well into the 20th century. The spirit of ecstasy, Rolls-Royce bonnet ornament, was made in this way. Given this groundbreaking innovation, it's easy to understand why the people have adopted a higher mode of reproduction here, a world of artifice where nature no longer gets into the way. If we imagine that any conceivable form can be manufactured this way, we can speak of an unleashing of the imagination, Einbildungskraft. The void has become a morphogenetic potency. Here one no longer struggles with hammered matter, but conceives things for which there is no model in nature. Consequently, the sculpture of the gods, outliving its creators, evokes in them the idea of eternal life. It's only inevitable that this god, unlike the male fertility deities before, must not be killed. With the surviving Zeus Metalon, the phantasm of metaphysics arises. And because the bull figure is considered offensive, we understand why the Minotaur, hidden in a labyrinth, must finally be eliminated. Quoting Hegel, we could say that the spirit of negation, an absolute spirit, makes its appearance. Paradoxically, this feeling of unbelonging, yes, of alienation from the world, is the moment when one says I with conviction. Because theoplastic is followed by socioplastic, development of archaic Greece displays an analogous course. As in the myth, the men begin to arm themselves with braces, greaves, helmet, and shield. The hoplite spirit emerges that characterizes the polis. These brotherhoods no longer march separately, but as one man. If the hoplite phalanx, sprung from the melting pot, forms a social plastic, one can observe how the spirit also affects the psyche of the individual warrior. Ernst Peter has told of a Doric initiation rite that predates our honeymoon. There, an older warrior comes to a family and presents them a gift, usually a bull. In return, he is given the son of the house. The two disappear into a cave where the elder endows his lover, wax in his hands, with the genius of the hoplite. After 2 weeks, the boy, who has become a man and has been given a shield and a spear, is returned to the family. On the cave where the initiation took place is emblazoned the inscription, "Here the axe attended the wine." Now, this Cretan honeymoon is undoubtedly a form of high reproduction, anticipating the idea of the gymnasium, in which gymnos, meaning naked, the idea of complete physical and mental plasticity is realized. So the lost form turns into negativity, turns into utopian spirit. Only on this basis can society be understood as a work of art, a nomos that follows self-chosen laws. The law of the universal machine, it liberates forms that are not of this world. Given that the first object of desire is God's sculpture, it's not surprising that the lost form is the gateway where metaphysics and religious monotheism come to be. Although one could easily draw a line to theology here, I would prefer to speak of allology, from allos, meaning alien. If the process of the lost form, but also the alphabet, are so fundamental for the construction of the Greek word, how is it possible that this social engine has been completely forgotten? As I said, we're dealing with a forma formans, a morphogenetic energy that creates tools in its image. Steve Jobs once made a wonderful remark. The computer is the solution. What we need is the problem. This inversion of causality, in which the solution precedes the problem, dissolves the very moment one imagines the universal machine in spatial terms as a mental continent that will only be fully revealed in the course of a longer period of time. This metaphor in mind, we speak of digital natives. But where can we place reason here? Now, intellectuals like to claim that they have things under control. This gesture of self-empowerment, however, denies that one cannot have a grip on a space in which there's always a rear. And furthermore, which is transcendent and open to the future. You're in it, but you can't control it. Here returns an embarrassment that has already been seen with the creation of the God's sculpture. How can you believe in a God you created yourself? Tomorrow I might endow him with other attributes or simply replace him by my maxime. Here at the latest, it becomes apparent why the first product of the machine was not an object of utility, but the deity by which the metallurgical practice could be elevated to collective ego ideal. With this apotheosis, the members of the guild could delude themselves that they had not tinkered their own knowledge themselves, but had received it from higher authorities. Basically, this is the initial of the collective unconscious. It creates a superego with which the group identifies itself and thus obscures the fact that one is not dealing with divine metaphysics, but with human tinkering. In his essay, Der Gedanke, the thought, Gottlob Frege insists that an idea belongs to a different sphere than a hammer. For while the individual creates facts with his hammer, the thought is conceived in the form of a conception. The painter Sigmar Polke has made this clear in a wonderful picture title. There's a black triangle in the upper right corner of the painting, and the title reads, Higher beings ordered, paint upper right corner black. It would be a lecture of its own if one wanted to trace the historical development towards the Holy Scriptures. Nevertheless, this line can be drawn. I've devoted myself all last summer to the study of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic, and in this respect, I can only refer you to the essay in Lettres Internationales. What is of particular interest in our context is how a foreign culture responds to the psychotope, in this case, the Hellenic cosmopolitan psychotope. The first thing to mention is that there is a cosmopolitan, if not imperialist, drive inherent in the universal machine. This also applies, by the way, to the computerization process that took off with the Unix epoch in the 1970s, and which we have misleadingly labeled as globalization. The subsequent clash of cultures, which in 2nd century BC, Judaism led to apocalyptic writing, to the Maccabean revolt, finally to the sanctification of scripture, can be understood psychologically as an identification with the enemy. It starts with facing an overwhelming force that's difficult to resist. Why? Because the Hellenic psychotope promises liberation from tribalistic bonds, and furthermore makes an extremely seductive offer. Educate yourself. Become a free citizen through art and philosophy. While the upper classes follow the offer with enthusiasm, the more conservative lower classes experience the intrusion of these designs as foreign domination. Psychologically, this is comparable to the contemporary split between the somewheres and the anywheres. The only chance to resist foreign domination is to incorporate the deified enemy as an introject while splitting off the foreign undesirable parts. So we have a split between symbolon and diabolon, or historically, the sanctification of scripture and the invention of the devil. Behind the scenes, however, the Greek psychotope penetrates the Jewish, later the Christian concept of religion. God is turned into a philologist and devotes himself to the subtleties of logos theology, the alien logic, as I would say, reading. In the long run, it's always the fine print that counts. What does the discovery of the psychotope mean for our present? Nothing else than one has to reckon with the collective unconscious mediated by a universal machine. It follows that one has to question the respective discourse on how it relates to social practices. This work is quite close to that of a psychoanalyst, except that one doesn't deal with the dream narratives of the patients, but with social institutions, education, law, sovereignty, gender roles, what counts as truth, as art, as value, as body ideal. One problem here is the fact that the transition from one universal machine to another is a source of conflict of the first order. The twitching corpse, you remember, money counting and praying. This seems to me the very signature of our present. Landed in the digital psychotope, our institutions and our discourses are remnants of a doomed world, the wreckage we use to stay afloat. Well, I don't want to go into the critique of the present at this point, but content myself with saying that we should look at the problems of the post-democratic, post-factual world under the premise of our alien logic. That would be the task. A psychoanalysis of our institutions, getting aware that we are part of a psychotope. I thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Martin Burckhardt, for this very fascinating and a very complex talk, and with a very broad band. I will now give the floor immediately, without losing any more time, to Timothy Snyder for his commentary.
Okay, thank you very much, Ayşe, and thank you very much, Martin Burckhardt, for being with us and for the richness of your work. What I'm going to try to do in the next few moments is to decode it in a way of my own, and then we'll ask you to respond, and then hopefully we'll have time for a broader discussion. So I'm going to make 5 brief points, which begin with a kind of introduction, and then which move to a question, which I'm going to ask over and over again in different ways. Just one question. So the introductory remark is to try to categorize you among the various critiques of our critics of our machine world. So very, very brutally simplifying, I would say there are optimists who tend to be libertarians, who think that our machine world will be wonderful because life is all about individual impulses and the machines can serve them. Life is all about having more free time. The machines will give us more free time. There's another school of thought, the pessimists, to which I'm probably a little bit closer. And the pessimists, I would say their political sensibility is Republican with a small r. They believe that there's some sort of political community, that we work well together in politics, but that the machine is getting in the way of that. The machine is making us too individual. It's alienating us. It's degrading us. It's drawing us apart. What you seem to be proposing, and again, you'll have to forgive the brutal simplification, but what you seem to be proposing is an entirely different third line of analysis, which would be, it's not that the machines are for us or that the machine is against us, but that the machine is us. Yeah. And that the machine has been us from the very beginning, using the word literally in a number of senses, literally from the beginning of Western civilization. The machine is us, and we are not any one way. So we're not, as the libertarians say, we're not individualists who just want fun and free time, but we're also not, as the communitarians say, or the Republicans say, we're not naturally in groups. We don't naturally form orderly political communities. We shimmer back and forth between these ways of being. And that shimmering, that lack of clear identity, is what's negotiated by the machine, what's negotiated by the unconscious. So we're not that good at being alone. We're not that good at being together. What we are good is in creating ways of going back and forth and reframing individuality, reframing community. And we do this by way of the machine. Okay, so that's the introduction. The first way I'm going to pose the question is by way of, let's call it literary analysis. It seems that one way to recast your argument would be in terms of a kind of literary analysis where something is unbearable. So, but by the way, this is like the category of unbearability is going to be important to what to my question, because as I see it, with the tension in us is that, you know, we like to be one way for a while till that becomes unbearable, then we like to be another way for a while and that becomes unbearable, and then we need a way to switch back and forth. Okay, so if I read you as literature, I could read you the following way: that there are things that are concrete, like for example, a bowl. And then there are things that are abstract, like for example, an A. And the letter A, as you say, genetically comes from a bowl, but we can't really bear that. I mean, you draw attention to it. I mean, in your work, you draw attention to a number of unbearable things, which is one of the fantastic parts of your work. But we can't really bear that A. We can't bear the A unless we're a poet, right? Unless we're Rimbaud. We don't like the A. We don't like to dwell on that. And so we immediately take that abstraction and we turn it back into something concrete. We turn it back into part of a word. And when we read a word, we're not even thinking of the word as a word. We're not seeing it as an abstract word. We're just experiencing it. We're reading through it. It's reading through us, right? So we can't take we can't deal with the abstract. The abstract is unbearable. We turn it into a different concrete. And what I'm trying to suggest in literary terms is that that's what the machine is all about. It's about the concrete becoming the abstract, becoming the concrete all over again, becoming familiar all over again, because we can't deal with the abstract. And I could make the same argument with the rock and the wheel and the machine, right? We don't like looking at just a wheel. We don't like thinking about the wheel. We don't like thinking about a gear, but we're okay with a machine because a machine is concrete again, right? So this is one way of recasting the argument. And then the question would be something like, does the computer really fit into this form of analysis? Was the computer ever actually concrete? Was it ever actually a concrete thing? I think it wasn't, but that's the question. Okay, the next way one might recast your analysis or recode it would be in terms of something you suggested a number of times, which is religion, right? And here the unbearable thing is not abstraction. The unbearable thing is creation, right? And the idea that creation is unbearable, I mean, is familiar. I mean, anyone who's tried to be an artist knows that a lot of what you do is immediately unbearable, right? I think of my child drawing something, then immediately tearing it up, even though I think that's not so bad. I wish I could have kept that. But creation is unbearable, right? I mean, God created the world and almost immediately destroyed it. The same is true in Greek mythology. The creation of the world is a very messy business with lots of destruction. And so on your account, it's not just that God creates the world and that's unbearable for God, understandably. It's also that we create God, right? We create God. We create the machine which allows us to create Zeus, and that recreates the story of Zeus, which is very beautiful and convincing. But I think what we have here again is a kind of unbearability. That is, we did create Zeus, but we can't really bear that we created Zeus. We would much prefer the story of the little iron men and so on, which clearly is a figuration of how we created Zeus. But the story takes the burden of creation away from us. We did it. We did the deed. We created something. But now the burden of the creation, the unbearability of the creation goes somewhere else. And so here again, I then ask the same question from a different angle, which is, with the computer, are we really creating, right? I mean, I realize that you do and some people do, but in general, are we creating with the computer? Is that what's actually happening? And one way I would ask this would be in terms of the body, right? So in the previous machines that you describe, it seems to me that our physical body, right, our Leib, is much more intimately involved than it is with the computer. Or our Leib has some leverage, right? Our body has some leverage on things, whereas it feels to me at least like the computer just has leverage on us. It determines where our neck bones are and what our posture is and how our fingers move and so on. Okay, so that was number 2, religion. Number 3 is Freud. So which is one of your chosen approaches. And so here, as I understand you, I mean, you're not saying what you're an optimist. I mean, you're much more of an optimist than Freud, and you're much more of an optimist than Marx, which is where I'm going to land too. Although I think your argument rhymes with both Freud and Marx. Freud says that civilization has a price, right? That there was something that we've lost. There was something that we've lost. We were once wild, and then we tamed ourselves, and so we've lost something. And isn't that tragic? You're not saying that at all. And Freud also says our various myths whether it's Rome or Christ or whatever, are various myths. They're a kind of like time-stamped, dated evidence of what we've lost, right? Our myths are, we look, the myths are a kind of trail behind us. They're like an exhaust fume, you know, of something that we've burned up. They're gone, but we can look at them, we can look at their shape, and we can say, aha, that points somewhere. It seems to me that you're not saying that at all. It seems to me that you're saying that our myths are not a sign of failure. Our myths are success. Our myths are what's good about us. The myths are the thing which proves that the machine isn't really on top. The myths are the thing that proves that the humans are deeply, intimately involved here, if not exactly in charge, but at least creative, right? At least creative. The humans are making stuff, and we should be understanding this as a success rather than as a failure, right? So, I mean, you can correct and you can react, but it seems to me that you like the Immaculate Conception. It seems to me that, like,
I have to admit it. Yeah.
Right. But who wouldn't? I mean, but you like these like incredible human bursts of fancy, which makes sense of everything. Like, I think that you're regarding this as success, like that this is really special, but we couldn't have done it without the machine, right? We couldn't have done it without the gears and the wheels. We wouldn't have the beautiful idea of the Immaculate Conception. Without the wax mold, we wouldn't have the idea of Zeus's childhood. Which brings me to so then the question here is the same question, which is the computer really like that? Right? Does the computer really help us make our myths, or does it take them away? Which leads me to Marx. So I think that, I mean, again, I'll be interested to see what you say, but I think what you argue is closest to Marx. I think it's closest to Marx than anything else. I mean, there's Walter Benjamin is like ringing bells somewhere in the background, but I think it's closest to Marx. Where Marx talks about a change in modes of production, you're talking about new machines and social engines. Where Marx talks about tools, you talk about deceiving nature, deceptions of nature, which is a beautiful phrase. But here again, it seems to me that you're more optimistic, or at least lighter than Marx, because with Marx, the things that we create alienate us, right? The things that we create alienate us. They reify us. Whereas in your account, it seems rather that we can create alien things, and there's something miraculous about that, right? The alphabet is a kind of miracle. We can create alien things, but those alien things don't alienate us, right? We're not alienated from the world. We go into the world and alienate it, right? We alienate the world from itself by doing this stuff that the world never would have thought of, like the alphabet. And that may change us, right? That may alter us, but it's not alienating us, at least not in a negative way. At least this is how I'm understanding you. You can correct me. And so there's in your account here again, there's the man is creative the whole time, right? It's not that we were very creative in the distant past, as Marx would want, and then we become ever less creative. We're creative the whole time. But then here, that I run up against my question now from this point of view, which is the computer our creation in the same way as these other kinds of machines, as the alphabet? I almost said Apple, which would have been an interesting little Freudian slip. As the alphabet, as the wheel, is it the same kind of machine? Is it the same quality, or has it become something else? So you quoted Steve Jobs about the computer being the computer is the answer we only need the question. But Steve Jobs is knowingly or unknowingly actually quoting Douglas Adams and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where the plot is that first you have the answer, and then you have to figure out what the question is, right? And you build a big computer to try to solve it. And my point here is that, like, that's the kind of fantasy that we had before we had the computer, before the machine was in our life. And I wonder a bit whether we have as much fantasy with the computer as we had before the computer. Or to sort of put the question directly to you, I mean, when I read Philosophie der Maschine, which is spectacular book, one of the few books I've read this century, which is truly mind-blowing or mind-altering. When I read Philosophie der Maschine, I wondered the whole time whether you were really describing the age of the computer, whether the computer really belonged with all these other machines whose philosophy you were writing, or whether it wasn't a kind of nostalgia that the age of the computer, which is really different from everything else, had allowed you to look back into the past and see it in this different and enlightening and fantastically creative way that you have. But is it really that the computer is part of that story, or is the computer the coda to that story? That's my question.
Thank you very much, Tim, for wonderful and questions, and for the translations into a very different domain. And I will, before opening the floor to the questions, I will of course give Martin Burckhardt the word to respond that, and I will remind the audience, please use the chat function for your questions afterwards. But Martin, first the floor is yours with those 5 questions. 1 question in 5 forms, sorry. I mean, it's 5 variations.
Audio in.
We don't hear you.
I mean, now I'm audible again.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, Timothy, I guess you really got my split nature, this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde nature, because I feel like I'm being part of the 2 teams in a way. But one team I'm not. I do not belong to that team, which is talking of the machine in regards of a blessing and a curse. So I wanted to get rid of this religious overloading of the machine. So I wanted to be really, in a Marxian sense, absolutely materialistic about the machine and what it does to people. So all the alienations included. So the point with the unbearable, you're perfectly right. I think culture can't live without getting rid of stuff. Yeah, you have to hide stuff. The Romans, the Greeks also had this wonderful saying that you need this ars oblivionis, the art of forgetting. It's not only about memory, being a historian, but the other side is knowing how to forget. So, and that's really crucial. I think philosophy would be impossible if the people always recall the alphabet, and being aware that it's like an exhaustion of the bull, getting rid of the bull. You can't live with that. You have to forget about it. It's like Adorno's Verblendungszusammenhang. So it's a necessity to live in a certain simulated world. So the unbearable is something which is essential for the rule of law, for example. You can't have law without having these getting rid of the unbearable things. You have to stand on some solid ground. But the point which makes me kind of nervous is that from time to time, when we change the machine, we have to readapt all our instruments. We have to rearrange our mindset, and all of a sudden, all these ghost inspectors come back again, and that's a horror in a way. So, to me, like going back into the cultural history was just to understand what the computer does to us. So, in fact, that was the main motivation for me, to understand what's coming in a way. So, and when I saw the changes of society, like the 14th century being remodeled by clockwork and so forth, you can't get really depressive about a few things, because we can really anticipate some dark clouds hanging over us. So I'm a split person in a way. Personally, as an artist, so to speak, I'm absolutely fascinated by this machine. I really like the Immaculate Conception, the Himmelsfahrtskommando. I like it really because it's like human artifice, human imagery. Yeah? You create all these fairy tales which are so enormous. But on the other hand, there's something you have to get rid of. And a kind of strange formula, and it's a very sinister formula found for that dialectics, in fact. And I had to tell it in German, I had to try to translate it first. Die Kultur ist eine Engelmacherin. So, die Engelmacherin, so getting rid of the babies. So it's abortion. Every aspect of culture is somehow getting rid of something else. And you know all the lost children, all the alienation, in fact, which happens there. So that's my formula, and I try to live in between. But changing the universal machine is a problem of the first order. And I think we're now in a situation, and I do understand why you insist upon the novelty of the computer to a certain respect. We're in a situation we have to figure everything out anew again, which is really, I mean, it's mind-blowing. The question if the computer is really something creative or something which people could handle. That was the reason why I got in my history of digitization back into the 18th century, because I had the idea there must be like comparable to the bull, comparable like to the medieval elements, water, fire, and so forth, for the clockwork to work. There must be something natural, something physical. That's why I got back to electricity. And electricity was something which is really interesting, because when I heard about this first experiment that Bernoulli did in the year 1746, that was mind-blowing. So I recounted for the people who don't know that. I did mention it quite a lot. So it's like 500 monks assembling on a big field in northern France, and they connecting themselves with wire. Yeah. And you've got this little jar with an antenna, and one of these monks was just touching this jar. And what happens? All the monks are quivering, are shaking, because electricity is flowing. It was a perfectly reasonable experiment. It was looking how fast is electricity. And they found out, okay, electricity is so fast that the human eye can't detect it. My first question was, as an author, was, what does it mean for writing? What does it mean for me personally? And there was kind of a depressive story which led to modern mass society, even to theories of fascism in a way. When I touch the antenna, and I really got gleichgeschaltet, I'm connected with everybody else, I'm shaking in synchronicity. And that is kind of strange. Yeah? So I'm not an individual anymore, I'm a individual. I'm sharing stuff with the other people. I mean, that's unbearable too. And it's one of the things which we now experience with, for example, with the outrage machines with Twitter. So we've got all these machines in us, and we've got all the fervor and the ire and the aggression in it. So that's kind of strange. We have to live with it somehow. So religion. And Freud is it's the most interesting question. He was a pessimist, sure, but on the other hand, he was a hidden philosopher. I studied the Freudian construction of the psychic apparatus long before he treated the hysterics. And in fact, he wanted to build a machine. He wanted to build a perfect electric machine. So he was reading Fechner, all these physicians from the 19th century, and that was his idea. And by the way, he was the first to understand the synapses, which is really strange. He called it Kontaktwiderstand. So because treating the brain as a machine, that led him to that. Later on, years later, all these myths like Oedipus, Electra, and that stuff came into the theater of his mind, which was there before, a perfect machine. I would say Freud, he was a philosopher in a way. He wanted to have the eternal. He wanted metaphysics. That's why he hung to the primal heart. My understanding of psychoanalytics would be we have to treat our psychotope as a historical problem, which is changing, a psychic apparatus which is changing. And it's not always the patricide, killing your father and sleeping with your mother. It's changing ideas. For example, having a beauty operation just to resemble your profile pic, which is, I mean, you can't imagine that. Okay. In this respect, I would say I want to get rid of the metaphysics in psychoanalysis. I really estimate the idea of psychoanalysis, but you have to get rid of it and to open it up for history. So the pessimist, the same counts for Marx, by the way. I estimate Marx very much and hold him in high esteem, but his understanding of money was kind of brutal and naive in a way. He says money wears uniform and belongs to an army, has an army. It wears uniform and has a Landessprache, a language of a certain nation. I mean, that's reality since the Bank of England, 17th century. If you go back centuries before, that's not the reality of capitalism. So in a way, Marx, he hides some eternal truth about money being the alienating force, like a demon, like a devil. Also in this respect, I want to get rid of the metaphysics in Marxian thinking. So, and that in the end you have to ask yourself, okay, what's the basic Gesellschaftstriebwerk? What's the social engine that's driving us? And I would say, in fact, nowadays it's the computer. It's the computer, and we've got all these other machines working pretty well, but it's the computer who's now decisive. And it's us, it's not somebody else, it's us. It's us. So we have to live with us, with ourselves, and have to look into the mirror and try to get to be optimistic in a way. But if we take the idea that the universal machine is not a tool, not a hammer, but a continent which opens up, it means it could last like 200, 300 years, 400 years until another universal machine shows up. That's kind of fine. And you feel kind of humble then. You don't have the idea that you have to master it. The idea of mastership is something we have to get rid of. And I see in our tendency, it's like in the 15th century, Lefebvre said, when the printing press was invented, he said, the 15th century was so acquainted with the medieval times, like the medieval times weren't acquainted with themselves, because they had all the books reprinted. We're going back to the 19th century. We're acquainted with the 19th century. We're not acquainted with the problems and the unbearable things that come out of the computer. And I would just emphasize and invite people, treat it as a chance, treat it as something beautiful. But I'm kind of, in reality, I'm really pessimistic.
Okay. Thank you very much. We don't want to end up with a pessimistic note that we we will pursue the questions further. And please do use the chat function if you have questions. Let me see whether there are. Right now, I don't see any questions. I don't see.
I see a question, Ayşe. Let me repost it to you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. From someone, Mark Paskman. Is this somehow related to Levinas, otherwise than being? Yes.
Not really. Not really. I liked Levinas when I read him in 2000 and something, but it's too much messianism in there. I really like the materialist side and treating things in life sides. So
okay.
Because it's opening up new questions, and a lot of deconstructivist philosophy is like an end game. It's like play it against them.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Ludger, and if he wants, he could pose the question himself, yeah, if Nikki allows.
I gave him the permission.
Sorry?
I gave him the permission. He can speak now.
Yes, Ludger.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do hear you very well.
Okay. I was just curious about the point that you made in the discussion, Martin. By the way, thank you for the talk. I had some difficulties understanding acoustically, but I think even if it had been better acoustically, I still would have had some difficulties following to everything because it was so manifold. But I found this point very interesting about forgetting that you made in the discussion, because we all tend to think that forgetting is this deficitary thing that we do not want to happen, but we have another idea of forgetting that is the Nietzschean approach to forgetting, that we need an active forgetting, that forgetting is something sanitary, helpful for our lives. What about the idea of implementing forgetting into the AI world? Is this in some sense possible, and how would that look like? That would be my question, Martin.
Yeah, sure. I think it's necessary even. For example, if you take machine learning algorithms, they take just the state of the art. So they would reproduce every prejudice and so forth. It's just the past. It's repeated and it's made super fast, light speed. So forgetting is something really crucial because it opens up the creative space. So sure, it's possible to make an algorithm which is able to forget, but I doubt whether people are really inclined to work with them. They like to have something solid, and but theoretically it's possible. Sure, it would make perfect sense. And you have to ask real value questions. I mean, if you rely upon a machine learning algorithm, it's like relying upon prejudices, upon the middleman, the average man. So you wouldn't normally in a culture which looks for sublimation, you wouldn't do that. In fact, you would look for the luxury. You would look for the most intelligent solution, not for the average man. So, not a good idea in my understanding.
Okay, there is another question. I would like to also add myself afterwards. It was partly related also with Ludger's question. Talking on and about machine, you mean certainly not the hardware, but software, which is symbolic machine. And this is to be considered certainly as part of mathematics. Your talk is built on alien logic, where you claim that there is an illusion as a social product, where we consider a cultural product as nature. Oh, actually, it was very close to mine. But who claims that the software, pure mathematics, is a nature but not culture? And if you mean yes, there is a thesis by someone that maths is nature. Whose idea is this, and what kind of nature is it?
I would say that programming understood as mathematics is a kind of a thorough misunderstanding. I would deem programming much more like a Geisteswissenschaft, like a part of the humanities, because it's treating the social fabric and it's changing society. It's all about society. It's all about politics. It's all about looking into the mirror and asking yourself, who am I? So the understanding of mathematics, even in the Boolean logic, it tries to get rid of the quanta, of the quantities. It tries to get into symbolic descriptions. I mean, there's a physical part in that too. It's electricity, it's speed of light, and it's we are able to forget about this because our chips are so fast. So, but obviously there is a physical side implemented also in these machines. So it's not only symbolic, but if we are free to write, as for example, like the people who had the alphabet were free to write with the alphabet, and didn't have to care about reproduction logic, we can do a lot of stuff, and that's not mathematics. I think it's a misunderstanding to understand programming as mathematics.
Okay. I have also one question that departs a little bit, but I would like to come back to Tim's point, that is with Marx, and if I translate what I am hearing, and I had the acoustic problem too, like Ludger, but if I translate what you were saying is that actually instead of the alien logic that you were talking about is for me, it's really, or in Marxian terms, that it is alienation. And what is you're talking about is the reification, mystification, fetishism, and creating a world of artifice, but which actually curtails itself. So this is the deception in the machine, and then the system blindness, that is this kind of the curtailment, so that it becomes illegible to itself, I mean, to the system itself, and so that the social practice or a product becomes as if it were nature. So then, and then you say that this is, you would like to get out of the metaphysics. And if I follow it that way, from that, I mean, it is in that sense translatable to the alienation and all that kind of the conceptual network that I think that Marx talks about. And then my question becomes, there is this domination aspect in it, which this is the way actually it is. If you want to get, I'm not sure how you get out of metaphysics, which you want to, but how do you do that is not clear to me, because how you are gonna, in terms of your claims that you want to open the, what is it, the psychotopos to history, but you can only open it to history and to kind of the beyond that, the curtailment, by looking at those processes that produce that one, which creates that kind of the alienation. And I would put that kind of the forgetting actually part of the domination. So I'm not sure where that the break, I mean, first of all, how you translate this yours in relation to the Marxian form. Put aside the money. I think that it is.
Money is important.
Sorry?
Money is really important in this respect.
Money is important, but maybe it is the more than the money, it is the capital, and it's a little bit different than money, I think. And so I'm not sure how you break with the metaphysics. I could see from the way that Marxian within the similar kind of the frame breaks from that. So how do you open the psychotopos to history and social process to analyze it?
Yeah, first you have to understand it. For example, and here the problem begins. For example, if we take money, it's really crucial to, because that's the metabolism of the psychotope, I would say, is really crucial. For example, if we take the end of Bretton Woods in the 1970s, that's the same time as globalization begins and the Unix time and so forth. So it's no coincidence in a way. So we don't have any natural shortages anymore, no more scarcity in regards of money. Money does not represent anything natural, no natural scarcity. What money represents nowadays is attention span, attention economy, it's libidinal economy. So this is really crazy. And the problem with our economics now is that we do not really see all the consequences of this libidinal economy, this attention economy, which is unfolding in the digital sphere in particular. For example, like this simple detail, like the Bitcoin currency, stuff like that, which is decentralized money. It's not the central bank anymore. All this concept of the 17th century, having the central state, central money, and central bank, and so forth, that's gone. And we see like all these perturbations of our digital world happening today and people ignoring it. So the first thing would be have a look at realities, really take a look and see what's going on, and see what's the driving force. The driving force, it's absolutely clear. It's the moment where I can just record, for example, like a click. I record a click, and this means representation. This means attention. This means somebody being invested in something. So, and this turns out to be an economy. So it's a computer economy, and we don't have it on our agenda. So you have to be clear about that. So the point of alienation, to be alienated from what? Like Timothy said, alienation has happened with the very moment the alphabet came into being. And it was like a pre-communist, pre-materialist times. Alienation seems to be, that's why it's called alien logic. It's obviously it's for our humanistic survival something essential. We can't live without alienation because we look at ourselves as if we were like extraterrestrial beings. So from another space, there's no nature. So we have to live with our culture. We have to live with our machines. And obviously there is a need of accommodating things that they turn to be humanistic, that they turn to be friendly to people. And that's a real problem. I've got the feeling that we treat the problems of today with the tools of yesterday. Like we're printing money. We should take care of the new economies, of the new attention economies. So obviously this was not really a sufficient answer, but the problem is really complicated because if we're talking about power, we would have to talk about money. Yeah, that's our social drive. And not talking about money in this respect. And now we get a vacuum. We got a void. There's nobody who's taking care of attention economy. It's in a post-statal society.
Okay, thanks. We have another question before we finish. That's why I'm just continuing, and we will have a chance to talk about those points, try to convince each other maybe. So I keep hearing the universal machine as the ratio logos of this as that, identity difference, simulacrum, dissimulation, where we are the machine in what you are saying. What am I missing? Apologies. I too have been having acoustic issues. Yes, I think we all had that. I don't know, maybe some others. I don't know whether, Tim, you had the acoustic problem too, but okay. So this was the question. I keep hearing the universal machine as the ratio logos of this as that. Identity difference, simulacrum, dissimulation, where we are the machine in what you are saying. Where are we in the machine?
Where are we? Yeah. Obviously, the machine is the universal machine. The computer is a dissimulation machine. I would say it dissimulates things. It turns things into the incorporeal. It disembodies things. So it's a dissimulation. We are vanishing to a certain degree, but vanishing in the corporeal sense could mean like appearing mentally, symbolically. It's maybe it's like with the COVID problem. Yeah, we're keeping distance, but mentally we're trying to get together. So, and maybe if you lose something, you get very sensitive about winning something else and getting the subtleties of communication. Maybe it's not only losing and dissimulation, maybe it's also like the expectance of a new world, another world, a new renaissance.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions, and actually I think we have exhausted our time. That's, I mean, and it opened even more questions, I think, that where we started, and actually this is very good, very fruitful, and we have the privilege of having Martin Burckhardt with us as a fellow, so some of us will have the chance to continue our conversations on that, to learn from Martin Burckhardt also.
Apologies for the sound, pardon me.
Yes, I don't.
Didn't check it obviously the correct way.
Yeah.
Pardon me.
I mean, I don't think that it is your fault, but it is. We are the victims of the technology.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Timothy Snyder, Martin Burckhardt, and thank you very much for your questions, and wishing you a nice evening. And some of you, I know that at IWM will have a chance to be together and continue the conversations in another form. Thank you. Good evening. Bye. Thanks.
Ciao.
Ciao.